So over recent weeks, we have been looking at the person of Joseph in the Bible. And to kind of help you to remember how the story started, well, Joseph had lots of dreams when he was younger. He had dreams that he would be in a position of influence, of power, of authority, into a position where others would submit to his authority, where he could shape the lives of other people. But as we found out in the story of Joseph, he actually went through a difficult period of his life. It covered a lot of years of his early life. And I think that's something worth acknowledging because sometimes we look back on our lives and we think, well, that's a decade wasted because of trial and suffering and so forth. But what we see in Joseph's context, yes, his early years, his 20s, was basically spent time in difficulty, traversing a difficult path. But actually, God was preparing him for something more in the future. And so instead of being the one to whom people would submit to, he had to submit to the authority of others. He even experienced injustice at the hands of others. And some would say, well, that was totally unjustified. It was uncalled for. That should have never happened to him. But I think what we find in this story of Joseph actually is that Scripture tells us that what he went through, the difficulties that he went through, was actually beneficial to him personally in terms of his personal development, in terms of his formation of character, his spiritual development, but also it was beneficial to all that God wanted to prepare him for to do as well. To which some might wonder, how can that be justified? I mean, how can it be justified? I mean, okay, Joseph was maybe a little bit of a cocky lad when he was younger. Maybe he gloated. Maybe that was his posture when he had these dreams of grandeur. But who can blame him for being a little bit, confident and cocky at that age? And in any event, wasn't it his father who was to blame for favoring him over his brothers? Was it his father the one that was at fault for causing this kind of rift between him and his brothers, and maybe this selfish, jealous kind of posture that had developed in his brothers? Wherever the fault lay in all of this, was it really justified that his brothers would sell Joseph into slavery? Was that justified? Was that really needed as part of his development? And then obviously he then got sold to work for Potiphar as well. Was that really needed? And as if that was not enough, Potiphar then threw him in prison. And what for? I mean, Joseph was doing the right thing. He was doing the right thing. He didn't want to sort of succumb to the advances of Potiphar's wife. He did the right thing, and he finds himself landing in prison. Was all this necessary for Joseph's development? I mean, put yourself in Joseph's shoes. He's a young boy and he's torn away from his family. How can that be justified? I mean, that was a traumatic experience. And to encounter that at such a young age as well. And as if that was not enough, when he ends up in prison, he realizes that there might be an opportunity for him to get out of prison. Because God has given him the gift to interpret dreams. And so he interprets the dream of this cupbearer that used to serve Pharaoh. And he interprets the dream and he thinks to himself, well, look, cupbearer, when you get out of here, remember me. Tell your master about me. And guess what? The cupbearer forgets about him. And so Joseph had to spend some more time under lock and key. How could all this be helpful? How could trial and suffering in any way be helpful to Joseph? Well, it's interesting that actually in the passage that we're looking at this morning from Genesis 45, actually Joseph answers that particular question. But before we consider what he has to say and what we can learn from this, let me just get you up to speed with where we are in the story. So Pharaoh, as we looked at last week, the leader of Egypt, has these dreams. They were unpleasant dreams, uncomfortable dreams. And at that moment, the cupbearer remembers Joseph. Yeah, I spent some time in prison with Joseph, and he interpreted my dream. Why don't you ask him? And so Pharaoh gets him out of prison. And Joseph declares, look, I can't interpret dreams, but I know God can interpret dreams. And so he interprets the dream to Pharaoh, which is that there's going to be 7 years of plenty. There's going to be a good period, bountiful crops, but then there's going to be 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh is absolutely delighted by this interpretation. So much so that he elevates Joseph into a position of authority and power, where he has authority over the land. And basically, he gives him the role of gathering the grain in the good years so that there's enough to distribute in the difficult years. And I was just fascinated when I was looking at Genesis chapter 41 as to the way in which Pharaoh responded to Joseph's interpretation. It says that Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and he made him ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, bow the knee. I thought that is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, this young guy has suffered so much, even had to unjustifiably be put into prison as well. But here he is now, and what that says to me is that the dreams that he had as a young age did come to pass. They did happen. They were real. They were clearly of God, and they came to pass. But it also made me realize that if he was about 30 years old when he was elevated into this position of authority and responsibility, that means that he spent a huge segment of his life in trial before God's great plan unfolded for him. And I think that is quite important for us. Because sometimes we're in the mire, aren't we? When are we going to get out of this difficult situation? But I think there's encouragement to take from Joseph's story, is that there is a future for us, for all of us. And I say there's a future for us even if we're in significantly severe health. And I'll speak, ill health, and I'll speak into that a little bit later. I think it reminds me that sometimes you've got to be patient. God is working behind the scenes. He has a plan for each of us. And in Joseph's life, that plan did unfold, not in Joseph's time, but in God's timing. And so we're going to get to Genesis chapter 45. And what happens in this chapter is a difficult situation for Joseph, because we're now in that period of scarcity. The years of plenty have happened. Now it's the years of famine. And who turns up in Egypt to get food? Joseph's brothers. And so he's going to come face to face with his brothers because they need food. He doesn't disclose his identity to begin with for a variety of reasons. But in this chapter, he reveals to Joseph, or Joseph reveals to his brothers, that he is actually their brother. And obviously they can't recognize him because Joseph looks very, very different. The verses will come up on the screen. It's verses 1 to 15 of Genesis 45. And I've titled this message, God's Plan in Human Suffering. So let's read. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. These are the brothers that sold him into slavery. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, It was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord over his entire household and ruler over all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me. You, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt and about everything you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly. Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him weeping, and he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. So really, really interesting passage of Joseph drawing close to his brothers, showing them kindness and compassion and love, even though they had mistreated him. But just as you reflect on Joseph's life, because obviously we want to learn something for ourselves through the story of Joseph, I wonder if you sometimes feel like Joseph. You know, like things are going a bit difficult for you. You know, there's a trial period that you're in, and whatever that period might be like, you know, it could be health challenges, financial challenges, relationship challenges, work challenges. As I've often said to people, you're either entering a trial, you're in the trial, or you're coming out of a trial and you're about to go into another one. And I think when you think about the world and the state of the world that we live in and the unpredictability of the world, that in itself causes anxiety and concern to people. And sometimes we don't know that we're carrying the concerns. You know, sometimes we're just totally unaware of it. We're kind of absorbing it in, aren't we? But this is what we're carrying. And I think that, you know, that kind of reflects itself in a variety of ways. And maybe you're like Joseph. You feel that you've been mistreated. You know, injustice. You know, it's not fair. When is this going to end? I wonder if you also would identify with David in the Bible, who wrote this Psalm 13, where he said these words, "How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart?" And so the interesting thing is that you have these kind of personal feelings when you're going through difficulty and challenge. But you might also be thinking, well, God, where are you in all of this? Because I've been praying day and night and you still haven't moved in my situation. I think the reality is that nobody really likes trial. Nobody likes suffering. And a natural human response, obviously, is when you do suffer, is that you want to get out of it. I mean, we seldom think there's going to be any benefit in going through a difficult situation. But what we discover in Joseph's story is that God can be working in the most trying of situations to outwork his purposes. But before we look at this, just note Joseph's response to finally making himself known to his brothers in verse 2. It says that he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him and Pharaoh's household heard about him. Joseph wept loudly. And just think about that for a moment. I mean, he's been elevated into a position of responsibility and power, hasn't he? And you think to yourself, well, Joseph, the last thing that you're going to do is weep in front of your brothers. Don't show weakness now. In fact, show strength. But what he does is he weeps loudly. And I'm just trying to read into or think through why was he weeping loudly? And this is the conclusion that I came to. He wept because he'd suffered trauma in his life. Huge trauma in his life. And he must have been carrying that, you know that weight throughout all those years when he was kind of separated from his family, separated from his father, when he was under lock and key in prison. And I just wonder, when he wept loudly, that was almost like letting it all out. Because sometimes when we are going through difficulty, we don't want to talk about it, do we? We just kind of like try and hold it in and try and get through into the next day and so forth. But there's that moment when he was trying to hold it all back and then he suddenly lets it all out. And I think that in that is a really, really important lesson. Because you can read about the Psalms of lament in the Bible, but there are so many, examples in the Bible of lament where people literally just cry out to God. And they're very, very honest with God about how they are feeling. And what I read from all of this is that we've got to be honest about our situations. We've got to sort of confront them. We've got to, try and deal with the facts as they are. And we've got to just allow the emotions to sort of come out. Because I think when we don't, it can cause problems further down the line. I mean, I think people have been to counseling sessions will tell you about how beneficial it has been in bringing to the fore past hurts and unresolved pain so that they can be re-examined and processed to help people to move on. But for us as Christians, the Bible also emphasizes the value of bringing things out into the open because it can bring fresh perspective as well. And it can actually bring hope in a crisis situation. So if you look back at that Psalm 13 that I just mentioned, that refrain in that psalm is, "How long, Lord?" And David gets really, really real with God about his difficult situation because he carries on by saying, "Look on me and answer, Lord my God." I mean, that's a bit forthright, isn't it? It's a bit forthright, coming to God in that way. Look on me and answer, Lord my God. But note how that psalm ends. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. Just look at the progression in that psalm. It started off with lament. It started off with, looking face to face with the difficulty and being real about it and being honest about it and being honest to God about it. And God moved David's, sort of posture on into a place of hope at the end. There was that renewed hope in the faithfulness of God. This is how the Apostle Paul puts it in Romans 8, 3-4. Suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. And I think that what we see in Joseph's situation, in that weeping is a sense of, I think, some healing going on in his life as well. And in all of this, I think we're reminded, are we not, that God is not absent in human suffering, but God is working through human suffering in a variety of different ways. And we see this particularly in the way that Joseph turns to his brothers after weeping loudly in Genesis 45. And this is what happens in verses 3-4. Joseph, first of all, declares who he is. "I'm Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Of course they were. Then Joseph said to his brothers, and this is the bit that I want to hone in on, "Come close to me. Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. Come close to me." And actually in verse 15, Joseph appears to be going even further where it says, "And he kissed all his brothers and wept over them." Oh my goodness. I mean, how do you get your head around that, Joseph? Because were you not sold into slavery as a young lad by these brothers, and now you're choosing to forgive your brothers and in some sense to absorb the pain that they inflicted upon you? I mean, come on. Don't you want to seek vengeance rather than having some kind of emotional reunion? But that is the refining power of God at work through human suffering. Because who brought Joseph to that place? Who enabled him, who shaped him, who cultivated the character, the posture to be able to get to that place? It was God. Because this is what the psalmist says, "For you, God, tested us, you refined us like silver," and Joseph was refined in the place of suffering. Well, what did he encounter in that place of suffering? Yes, difficulty, estrangement from his family, having to deal with the mental turmoil of so much change, because it was so much change, in a short period of time, uncertainty in his life. But I tell you what he also learned in that dark place. He learned about the faithfulness and the goodness of God. And there is that refrain, is there not? The Lord was with him. The Lord was with him. Yes, he's going through the difficulty, but the Lord was with him. And so in that place, he found out about the goodness and the loving kindness of God, and clearly developed a compassionate heart himself. Because when you receive goodness from others, you're able to reflect that goodness. When we encounter the love of God, it enables us to show that love to others. And so he says to his brothers, come close to me. It is a remarkable gesture of brotherly affection, and this so quickly. Now, how did he get to that place so quickly? This is the important point. Verse 5. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God, listen to this bit, sent me ahead of you. Notice the word sent me ahead of you. If you want to know how Joseph arrived so quickly at that place of brotherly affection and forgiveness, because it happened so quickly. I mean, it doesn't happen this quickly normally, does it? If somebody has hurt you, it is going to take you sometimes days, months, years, decades, a whole lifetime to process all of that if somebody has hurt you. But Joseph seems to have arrived at a place a lot quicker. It is the place that we all need to arrive to. But what helped him was the realization that God sent me ahead of you. And he reiterates that point again. In verse 7, he says the same words again, but God sent me ahead of you, to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. And then in verse 8, Joseph repeats himself again by saying, so then it was not you who sent me here, but God. So 3 times he's emphasizing the point that God sent me to Egypt. Now, I don't know about you, but that kind of starts to mess around with my head. And let me break it down why that kind of starts to sort of mess with my head, this idea that God sent him to Egypt because he suffered. That's why it starts to mess with my head. Okay, if you think about it for a moment, that's effectively what he's saying. Yeah, God sent me, and all this stuff that I've gone through, well, did God have a kind of a role and part in it? I think for us as Christians, we like to distance God from anything to do with human suffering. And so I think a classic kind of response to human suffering is this: well, there is suffering in the world because of sin. And I think that is absolutely right. I think that if there was no sin, there would be no human suffering. Let's be honest, there wouldn't be. If you go back to the Garden of Eden, the early chapters of Genesis, and you look at their life before human sin, it was absolutely perfect. But as soon as sin came into the world, everything got distorted, relationships got fractured, and our relationship with the environment also got fractured as well. And so one of the kind of, outcomes of sin is human suffering. Yet in the context of Genesis 45, Joseph seems to be suggesting something other than human sin being the cause of his trial period, because he says, it was not you who sent me here, but God. Wow. But before I move on to try and explain what Joseph meant by this, let me make this point. We can't get away from the fact that actually, if you look at the scriptures, there are moments in the Bible when God ordains, allows human suffering to take place, to discipline his people, to refine his people. And if you look to the Old Testament, and particularly to the way that God related to the Israelites as he was leading them in the wilderness, as he rescued them out of slavery in Egypt, there were moments of intense suffering for the people of God. And let's just be clear, God imparted that onto the people. And he did it not for the sake of some arbitrary cruelty, but to refine and discipline. And so there are moments, I think we've got to accept, that yes, there is suffering because of human sin, but there are times when God allows humans to suffer to refine and discipline and to shape people. But does that mean that God caused Joseph to suffer? That's the big question in all of this. Well, because he does say that God sent him to Egypt. Now, before you begin to think that this absolves Joseph's brothers from any wrongdoing, let's not ignore the facts. The facts are very, very clear. It was the brothers and not God who sold Joseph into slavery. And so, therefore, the suffering he endured was at the hands of them and not God. This being the case, how can you therefore make sense of the words of Joseph? Because Joseph has said, "It was not you who sent me here, but God." And I think that this is what Joseph was pointing to. And this is a really crucial and important lesson for us all. He was pointing to the overarching plan of God and how God can work out his purposes in any given situation. When you encounter the injustice of someone else, God can still work out his good, pleasing, and perfect plans through that, even through the bad decisions of others. When you look at the war, for example, it's terrible, isn't it? You look at the Ukraine-Russia war, and it's horrible, isn't it? And those are the decisions that human beings have made, and they're inflicting a lot of suffering. But God is still at work through that. And we know that to be the case because of the number of people that have turned to Christ as a result of that. And I think what's quite interesting in the church, this unpredictability that we're experiencing because of decisions made by people in power is causing anxiety. God is working through that to bring lots of young people into the faith. And I think that that is really what Joseph is getting at. And I'd say that that's what he's getting at, that yes, it was the brothers that caused this, but God was still working out his plans in and through it. And I'd say that because if you go to Genesis 50:20, this is what Joseph says. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." It's true. His brothers mistreated him by selling him into slavery. Nonetheless, God worked through their decisions, his own purposes, by which Joseph was prepared and shaped and refined and grew in character and faith to be able to take on that role of having authority in Egypt, and a compassionate heart to care for people that they would not die of starvation during the difficult years. But this is where it gets really, really interesting. In Joseph going through that difficult period, God worked out his purposes not just for the people of Egypt, but for God's people as well, the Israelites. Because as a result of him, his family was also saved as well. And that is worth considering because it was through Abraham's lineage, of which Joseph was a part of, from which Jesus Christ came forth. So isn't that amazing? But the thing is that Joseph wouldn't have understood all of this. In the midst of it, he might have just been thinking to himself, why am I going through this? This is not fair. But he gradually began to realize, particularly as he stepped into that role in Egypt, that God had a plan for his life through the difficulties that he was facing. But obviously he wouldn't have known the extent of God's plan and the breadth of God's plan, because obviously through the Israelites came forth Christ, the Savior of the world. And so what this says to me is that God is working behind the scenes of my life, of your life, whatever you're going through. God is sovereign. God is at work through those who believe in him. This being the case, when you're suffering, this is not in vain. It's not in vain. There is always something beneficial that comes out of suffering. This is what it says in verses 6 to 7 of 1 Peter 1. "In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials." And I know that Peter is talking obviously about persecution there, but we suffer grief in trials, don't we, throughout our life? They have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Let's take comfort from these words, because what it says to us is that trial is temporary. It's temporary because our earthly existence is very, very short. It's a feature of our life. Jesus is very clear. In this world there will be trial. You'll encounter it from time to time. So let's take comfort from the fact it is temporary. It's restricted to this lifetime. But also let's take comfort in the knowledge that God is working in and through suffering for his good purposes, such as bringing people to faith, such as testing their faith, such as growing their faith, such as shaping people's character, and also preparing them for the next part of God's plan for their life. So if you're going through a difficult period right now, it could well be that God is preparing you for something to come, the next plan of your life that is about to unfold. But suffering is never easy. But I want you to see suffering in new light today, with an appreciation that God is working in us for his glory. This is what Paul says in Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. We have been called by God and for the sake of his purpose. And I take the assurance from that whatever happens in my life and your life, God is at work working behind the scenes. I want to end with this. I did the funeral of Maureen Mostart, as I mentioned earlier, on Friday, and she endured a lot of trial. You will have no idea of the extent of it. I sat with Maria just before Easter listening to a story, but there are others here that will have heard the story before me, but we're talking significant childhood trauma. Like, it's bad, okay? And I was thinking about her life, that she suffered then, but God was working out his purposes through the suffering, because one of the, what happened as a result of some of the suffering was that she ended up in church as a child. They were forced to have to go to church. It was that kind of situation. And sometimes 3 times a day, because obviously they were kept out of the house. And that was their experience. But she did finally come to faith herself in her later years. Actually, it was at the age of 80 that she was baptized. And those latter years, 80 to 86, she suffered a lot, okay? A lot of health challenges. I didn't realize that she'd had more than one cancer as well. We're talking 3 cancers. And throughout her life. So a lot going on. But those last 6 years were really, really difficult. But when I took time to spend with Maureen, she was zealous for God. She was passionate for God. And I said it at the funeral, I said it to you, this morning, that as I was praying for her, she was interjecting all the time. I mean, it was like this woman was on fire for God. She was literally at the end of her seat and she was going for it. Yeah, and you tell God this, and you tell God that, and you tell God that. This woman was suffering. If you saw the scar on her leg, I mean, it was a massive, massive clot. It was literally the whole bit of the bottom of her leg. She was suffering, but God was still at work in her life. She went on to pass away, knowing the truth of Paul's words. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us.